The solution that we're going to be talking about in this particular region module is U.S. government aid. Now, there are a number of different types of U.S. government aid that impact the sorts of things that we're talking about in the course. Most of these would fall under what I've listed below as the economic and development aspects of U.S. aid. There are, of course, other kinds of foreign aid as well, including military aid and aid that is focused on international security, such as aid that goes to foreign militaries, to anti-terrorism, anti-drugs, and things like that. But there's also a whole arm of U.S. government aid that works on things like health programs, economic development, refugee assistance, and a range of other things that we're familiar with from this course. Included in this would also be support for the Peace Corps. Now, the agency that is largely responsible for that kind of aid is USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, which has been around in one form or another for many, many decades, though the current iteration comes from the Kennedy administration. It's a part of the U.S. State Department, and as such it answers to the Secretary of State, but there's an independent director who actually manages the affairs of the agency. Now, the agency does a variety of different types of development things, including all of the things that we'll end up talking about in this course with respect to the things that a single organization does: holistic development programs, single solution development programs, and disaster relief related things, which we're not going to talk about until the very end of the course, but USAID does do a lot of that. The programs that USAID implements take place in a range of countries in all the various regions of the world. And in fact, you can go to their website, which is linked on Blackboard, and you can click on a map to see where all the different projects are taking place. Now, USAID has been involved in controversy, as have most parts of the government at various times in its history. At times, USAID has been criticized for being very wasteful of resources and only serving really the interests of American contractors who do some of the work for USAID. It's also been accused, particularly by other governments and also by organizations outside of the U.S., as really acting as more of an international political agency that uses aid as a weapon rather than a tool. Now, a lot of the problems that are associated with USAID have been worked out, and the USAID really has been making an effort, particularly in the last decade or so, to make US aid very transparent and as effective as possible. And you'll see reflections of that on the website, where you can actually go look at the projects that USAID is doing, and then also look at studies of effectiveness as well. And most recently, USAID has been getting externally audited so that US citizens can see directly where that aid is going. And that's important because there are a lot of interesting conceptions and misconceptions about U.S. foreign aid. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit because I think it's really important and interesting to be thinking about how our government engages in assistance abroad and whether or not we do enough or need to do more. Now, I want to say from the start that the categories of aid change from year to year, so it can be very difficult to make comparisons between one budget year and another budget year. And so this is not an entirely accurate reflection of how things have changed in the last 2 years, nor could we ever really probably come up with a very precise number for USAID for every single year unless we did a whole lot of research on it. But I did want to point out what the budget for U.S. foreign aid has been like both during the last year of President Obama's administration and the proposed budget for the first full year of President Trump's administration. And I'm showing these two not because I'm trying to, cast some sort of ill light on President Trump's budget, but more just so you can see that while there have been some very significant budget cuts made to foreign aid in the last year, the reality is that the budget under the Obama administration was not a really huge number. For example, in 2017, the Obama administration spent 42.4 billion US dollars, which was just about 1% of the total US budget on foreign aid. That number shrinks to 0.6% under President Trump, with a total budget of 25.3 billion. Another way to measure foreign aid in budgets is to look at what percentage of the gross national income a country spends on foreign aid. And the U.S. spends something like 0.19% of gross national income on foreign aid. Compared to a number of other developed countries around the world, that's actually a relatively small amount. Sweden, for example, spends 1.1% of GNI, and Norway 0.99%. They're the highest, and of course I show them because they are the highest. But just to get some sort of perspective here, that what the U.S. is spending compared to other countries is a fairly small number. Now, it's interesting that the public perceptions of foreign aid are really different than this. The Kaiser Family Foundation did a poll a couple of years ago where they asked American citizens what they thought the U.S. government spent in foreign aid. Interestingly enough, only about 1 in 20 Americans know that the U.S. foreign spending on foreign aid is less than 1%. When asked to estimate what percentage of the budget goes to foreign aid, the number that Americans come up with on average is 26% of the budget going to foreign aid. With, of course, some people accurately pegging it at 1%, but many people pegging the number at over 50% of the U.S. total budget. When asked before they have knowledge of how much the U.S. actually does spend on foreign aid, what they think is about right, Americans think about 10% of the American budget spent on foreign aid is the right number. These numbers are interesting, I think, because it demonstrates, in the context of a course on global issues, that number one, we don't spend a huge portion of our budget on foreign aid. It's actually smaller than other countries. Yet we often feel like the U.S. spends a huge amount of money on foreign aid. The reality, of course, being that it's far less than what Americans think that it is. And I think this is important because, it begs the question, what is the right amount? And, how should we be spending this money? And I'm not necessarily arguing here that we should be spending more or even less, but rather that we should spend a little bit of time thinking about what aid actually does, and if we could use aid money in a way that would more effectively meet the needs of the American public. What does foreign aid do? Well, of course, it helps people around the world, which is important. But it also improves perceptions of Americans overseas. And actually, Americans believe that this is the case, and people in other countries also believe that this is the case as well. Foreign aid also helps to improve our relationship with other countries, not just how people perceive what Americans are like, but with our actual foreign relations with other countries. So it serves a number of potential purposes around the world. And we should probably be thinking, using some empirical evidence, about what we should be doing and whether or not it's realistic even to suggest that we can help to balance the U.S. federal budget by cutting foreign aid. And I think this is particularly important as we dive deeper into the 21st century, because many other countries around the world are trying to find ways to spend more on foreign aid. And one country in particular that's been fairly effective in its use of foreign aid, particularly for developing foreign relations, is China, which is increasingly becoming one of our big global competitors around the world. As they increase their presence, we are actually shrinking our presence right now. And we should really be having a good conversation about whether or not that's a prudent idea or not.